Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. I'm Lydia Wilson, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. 2024 was, sadly, a year in which so many of the world's conflicts seemed as though they might never end. From Gaza to Ukraine and Sudan, these brutal wars continued to devastate the lands over which they were fought and the lives of the people that called those lands home. And then, one of the world's seeming forever wars in Syria took a surprising turn. Facts on the ground, apparently established and immovable, changed almost overnight with the rapid advance in December of rebel forces on Damascus and the flight of President Bashar al-Assad. Shortly before the collapse of the Assad regime, I spoke to Mary Kaldor, Professor Emerita of Global Governance and Director of the Conflict Research Programme at the London School of Economics and Political Science. We discussed the idea of forever wars and the different ways in which they can ultimately come to an end. I began that conversation asking Mary, a returning guest to the podcast, not only how wars can end, but how they should end.
Well, actually, classic wars, which were fought in an existential way, and I'm thinking of the Second World War or the First World War or the Napoleonic, well, not the First World War really, or the Napoleonic Wars, they continued until the enemy was completely destroyed. But these were contests, deep-rooted contests, which, as Clausewitz pointed out, tend to the extreme. You use all the violence you can and you destroy everything until you finally win or lose. And wars aren't like that any longer because actually we know that escalation is going to lead to annihilation, and increasingly military technology, even in the hands of people like the Houthis or Hamas, is tremendously effective. So actually, as we discussed last time, in fact, contemporary wars are very much directed against civilians. Battles are rather rare. And these are wars in which the various actors, they might be militias, they might be non-state actors, they might be authoritarian leaders who find war is very useful to remain in power, have all sorts of interests in continuing war rather than in winning or losing. And in those circumstances, conflict resolution simply doesn't work because we assume a deep-rooted conflict, but actually, is there a deep-rooted conflict between Netanyahu and Hamas? There's a deep-rooted conflict between the existence of Israel and Palestinians, but actually Netanyahu has facilitated finance from Hamas. They operate a kind of mutual enterprise, and it's useful for both of them. Both of them remain in power because they're seen as protectors, because they're continuing the war. And my feeling is that it's going to be very difficult to end the war with either Netanyahu or Hamas in positions of power. So what essentially happens in contemporary wars is that the people who fight the wars, armed groups, militias, authoritarian states, often under the guise of extremist ideologies based on fear, they will only agree to conflict resolution if it entrenches their positions and makes them permanent. So somewhere like Bosnia, for example, which is usually considered the big success of conflict resolution, what happened was really it was an agreement among ethnic warlords to all of them remain in power. And Bosnia is a really dysfunctional country with very high unemployment. If you go there, you feel it's 30 years since Dayton, and yet you have the feeling that the war never ended. And that is the best example we have. And it was only possible because there were NATO troops and because Western countries spent more per head than they spent on martial aid to keep the arrangement going.
So it wasn't a resolve, there wasn't the resolution, there was the funding to maintain a status quo.
Yes, but was there really ever a conflict? Both sides wanted ethnically clean territories, and both sides wanted to remain in power. So were they in conflict with each other? Even before the war, apparently, Tudjman and Milosevic, the leaders of Croatia and Serbia, drew on a piece of paper the map, which they eventually got. And the real conflict was with civil society, with people of mixed ethnicity, all of that kind of thing. And that certainly was never resolved.
Well, speaking of that, we actually had Yasmin Mujanovic on the podcast earlier this year, and he would absolutely agree with your characterization that the Dayton Accords embedded the warlords. It didn't resolve the conflict. His solution was a greater commitment to liberal democracy, which he argued offers more security, more rights for minority communities. Would you agree that that might be the way forward?
I completely agree with that. But the question is, how do you get there? And I feel this was always about democracy. I think what is really striking about new wars is that they nearly always start with demonstrations for democracy. So you could characterize these wars as really being about authoritarianism versus democracy. And what happens is that the authoritarian leaders try to channel this conflict into ethnic conflict or sectarian conflict as a way of suppressing demonstrations. And it's happened over and over again. You know, when the Bosnian War started, they always talked about multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilinguistic, multicultural demonstration in Sarajevo calling for an international protectorate for Bosnia. And the first person who got killed was actually a Croatian student from Dubrovnik. Or you take the example of Syria. Assad dubbed the protesters as Sunnis who hated Shia, and deliberately fostered a kind of Sunni-Shia conflict where there wasn't one to begin with, where it was both Sunnis and Shia and Jews and Christians all in the demonstrations. And in a way, you can argue that the large bulk of the demonstrators, and that was true in Ukraine, it was true in Syria, it was true in Bosnia, were really against violence because they thought they could never win through violence. But what happens is certain, what my colleague Alex de Waal calls political entrepreneurs, take advantage of the situation and recruit people to join militias. This is exactly what happened in Syria. You've got donors from the Gulf area creating these Sunni militias. And it's not the kind of nice middle-class people who take part in the demonstrations who are calling for democracy. It's poor young men from the countryside who've been unemployed as a result of neoliberal policies who then join the militias. That was exactly the case in both Bosnia and Syria. So then the demonstrators turn themselves into civil society. They become the first responders when there's an attack. They try to negotiate ceasefires at local levels. They collect evidence of war crimes. They do all kinds of things that we call civil society.
Yes. Well, can we then think about the Gaza conflict in that kind of structure? Because in a way, it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of your conception of new and old wars. Because you have had calls for increased democracy in both Israel and Palestine to their own governments and from the Palestinians to Israel. You've had increasing sectarianism and extremism in identity politics. But what we're seeing in this particular outbreak and this particular manifestation of the violence is actually quite a conventional war around territory and around mass bombardment and a ground invasion. So how does Gaza fit into your conceptions?
Well, is it conventional war? I think it's absolutely not conventional war. Conventional war is soldiers facing each other in a field. This is attacking civilians. It's not clear to me that it's legal to attack soldiers as individuals instead of as a part of a collective, nor is it clear to me whether Hamas combatants, they call them illegal combatants, can even be called soldiers. But the Israeli argument is they're killing a terrorist or an illegal combatant, and it's easier to kill him in his home with his family. To me, it's not ever part of conventional war. It's attacks on civilians in much the same way as you see in most other contemporary wars.
Yes, you said it wasn't conventional. And so, yes, in that way, it fits directly into your conception of new war, which is all about the targeting of civilians, but also the asymmetric warfare and the guerrilla, the insurgent tactics like breaking into people's homes. So in that way, it fits right in. Is that right?
Yes, I think it does fit right in. I mean, there's no way that Israel can militarily defeat Hamas. And there's no way that Hamas can militarily defeat Israel. So what is going on here? And Netanyahu knows that if the war ends, there'll be elections and he will be prosecuted.
Yeah. If what you're saying earlier is correct, is in that both of them want it. This is why it's not a conflict. It's more of an agreement to have violence.
Exactly. I mean, I have to say one thing that, when I say this, Palestinians often say to me that thinking about it as a mutual enterprise doesn't take into account the asymmetry of the conflict. And I feel that is really the case, in that there is a deep-rooted conflict in the sense that the very existence of Israel, the continued occupation over years and years and years, that's the real conflict. So there is a conflict between Palestinians and the state of Israel going on. But this is overlaid by, if you like, a new war. The conflict becomes a justification for this kind of war.
Yes, so the violence, the manifestation of it, is a new war.
Yes, that's what I think. And I think it was from 1948, with the expulsion of the Palestinians, did anticipate a lot of the new wars. Was it the last gasp of colonialism or the beginning of a new war? I don't know. But, the ethnic cleansing that took place is very characteristic of a new war. It was about political control of territory through getting rid of people you don't want.
And targeting civilians as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And you have said two things in the past, one of which I did mention on the last podcast, which was a quote where you said, "It is hard to find a single example of humanitarian intervention during the 1990s that can be unequivocally declared a success." And yet you published an article just a few months ago in Social Europe where you argue that there should be a humanitarian intervention in Gaza. How do you think we can buck the trend of getting it so wrong and do a better job in Gaza?
By the way, I think there's one example that was a real success, and that's Sierra Leone.
Oh, can you explain?
Well, I think it was probably just easier, but the British forces came in, they dealt with what were called the West Side Boys, they were supported by civil society, they had a nice process of transitional justice, and Sierra Leone is now a relatively calm democratic country.
And so the differences were the engagement with civil society?
Well, my view is, And I think already the British forces that did it were aware of this. The problem with humanitarian intervention is that it was interpreted by the dominant powers as war fighting for humanitarian ends. So essentially, they used excessive force in most cases. And there wasn't a real understanding that if your ends are human rights, if you're trying to end genocide, I don't know, ethnic cleansing or crimes against humanity, you can't use methods of war which themselves violate human rights. So I think in most cases, they used excessive force. So they used force in the wrong way. I don't think excessive is right. They used force in the wrong way. So Kosovo is the supreme example of humanitarian intervention. And I was someone who really supported the idea that the international community had a responsibility to stop the Serbs from ethnically cleansing Albanians. But the method they chose was bombing. And you can't stop what's happening on the ground through bombing. It was successful in the end in that Milosevic capitulated and the Albanians were allowed to return to their homes. But it left a legacy of deep division between Albanians and Serbs. And there were 2,000 or 3,000 people that were killed through collateral damage. And because NATO wasn't on the ground, it empowered the KLA, the military arm of the Albanians. And the Albanians had had a nonviolent protest from 1990 onwards. And so it elevated the more violent people, which is exactly what happened again in Libya. And I think not nearly enough thought has gone into, this is why I'm so preoccupied with human security, which I understand not just as UNDP understood it, which was, you know, security for individuals rather than the state, and security from material threats as well as physical threats. I mean, I agree with all that. But I think it involves a completely different way of using the military, which I think some militaries are beginning to understand, which is quite interesting. The British have adopted human security, and rather amazingly, there's a sort of human security cell within the Ministry of Defence. So what does it mean? Well, it means that military operations are much more like policing, in that you put the protection of civilians before the goal of defeating the enemy. I mean, soldiers might say, but we can't protect civilians without defeating the enemies, which would be the case for Ukraine, for example. But the way that I kind of formulate it is, if you think about international humanitarian law, under international humanitarian law, you are permitted to kill civilians provided it's necessary in order to achieve military victory. So collateral damage is allowed, but it has to be proportionate to the gains that would be gained from a military victory. So collateral damage is something that's acceptable in military operations. With human security, it goes exactly the other way around, which is that it's permitted to kill enemies, provided it's necessary to protect civilians.
Oh, so you're inverting the entire paradigm.
Exactly. And so what I think is there's a desperate need for humanitarian intervention to protect civilians from these kinds of armed actors. But it needs to be done in a completely new way.
Now, it's difficult to argue with any of this that puts human life first, that puts that at the centre of all operations. Of course it is, but you can't choose your enemy. And so you're arguing against using bombs in order to stop violence. But it's hard to really imagine some wars stopping any other way. And you've mentioned Ukraine, but there's also Syria. Assad wasn't going to be stopped with any other approach.
I think actually Syria is a real example of the failure of humanitarian intervention. It was, I think during the 90s, there were real efforts by the UN to resolve conflicts, and they didn't do it perfectly. So I'm saying I supported Kosovo. Actually, this wasn't a UN operation, but, there were all kinds. But when it came to Syria, initially there was the 10-point plan of Kofi Annan. And then they put human rights monitors into Syria. It would have been great to strengthen those. I think it was a huge mistake to withdraw them. And maybe, I would have supported in the Syrian case. So I'm not saying bombs by themselves are wrong. I'm just saying bombs don't stop ethnic cleansing. But, if you compare Libya with Syria, a lot of people say Libya was a huge mistake. And Libya was very similar to Kosovo. It was the first responsibility to protect operation. And in fact, the task was given to NATO. And the only thing NATO knew how to do was to bomb. And so the consequences were that, as you know, it was initially to stop Gaddafi attacking Benghazi. But then once they'd done that, it escalated, and NATO said their aim was regime change, and so they supported the militias on the ground, and it left the militias really powerful. Having said that, what I do think is the case is that the bombing destroyed Gaddafi's air force and heavy weapons, so that actually this is a very unfashionable position. The violence was less horrible than in Syria. Point really is, it's how you do it. And humanitarian intervention has failed because people have treated it like classic military operations, and it's not. So I'm still in favor of it if people would learn how to do it. And the piece I published a few weeks ago was really protecting food convoys. Ideally, of course, you have to have UN agreement, but you also have to have the capacity to protect people on the ground. So maybe the argument is, I'm not necessarily against bombing, but bombing can't, you can't protect people on the ground. And that was the lesson of both Kosovo and Libya from the air.
Well, you've made an argument for a different way of doing it, but you also just mentioned that NATO is still doing things in the only way it's ever known how. And I just wondered if we could talk about NATO for a bit, because you wrote an article in 1999 when NATO turned 50. Now, you argued that post the Cold War, NATO should be less about the territorial defence of the West and more about upholding international law everywhere. Now, 25 years on, NATO's turning 75. I wonder how you feel about that argument and what has happened in the meantime.
Well, after the end of the Cold War, I kind of hoped that both NATO and the Warsaw Pact would be dissolved, and that we would have a pan-European security system, which included Russia. And it would be essentially based on human security. That didn't happen. And now we're in a situation which is a bit like the Cold War, with Russia being very aggressive and NATO needing to be defensive. And I still think we can think along the same lines as I was arguing in the case of crisis management. We need to protect civilians, but without being provocative. And so we need a defensive approach rather than an offensive approach. I mean, at the moment, NATO is very much, it's evolved out of World War II thinking. It's very much a nuclear alliance. The tripwire still exists, even though I'm very skeptical. I mean, the tripwire says that if Russia were to invade the Baltic states, NATO would respond with nuclear weapons. And the Baltic states themselves are very nervous. So they're talking about deterrence. I mean, now there's a real commitment to strengthen NATO. There's a real fear of what Russia might be up to. And I think it is a moment to turn NATO into not just a defensive alliance in theory, but a defensive alliance in terms of how it organizes its armed forces.
Well, I mean, we spoke 2 years and 3 months ago, and that was largely about Ukraine-Russia conflict. So really, all this time on, we really are seeing an example of your forever war, aren't we?
I don't know. I mean, it's a forever war in a very different way. I mean, I started thinking about that last year because this idea of wars as mutual enterprises. I mean, I saw the Cold War as a mutual enterprise in which the Soviet Union and the United States needed enemies and it served each other's interests. But I think almost all wars, if they continue, turn into, if you like, forever wars, simply because of this point about the difficulty of winning. I think Ukraine and Russia, this is different from a new war in the sense that they do want to win. I mean, for Putin, winning might mean that it continues forever, that he creates chaos instead of democracy. But Ukraine is desperate to win. But winning is incredibly hard because we're all terrified of escalation. And the more it escalates, the more we're afraid that it could turn into a nuclear war. And so, the Germans and the Americans and everybody is on this tightrope of trying to support Ukraine without escalating. But even if we escalate, it won't necessarily mean that Ukraine wins because it could just get more and more and more deliberate attacks on civilian critical infrastructure, on hospitals, on schools, it's just horrible.
It is. Now, I wonder if we return back to the idea of finishing wars, ending wars, I wonder if we could think about the role of international institutions. In particular, we've had the ICC ruling. We recently had an essay in New Lines written by Shachar Pinsker. He wrote a profile of Holocaust survivor and former Israeli diplomat Theodor Meron, who advised the ICC prosecutor on the case against Israeli and Hamas leadership. The essay raised the question of whether international humanitarian law is actually implicated in the failures to resolve injustices around the world because of its limitations. Do you think international law is actually part of the problem?
Well, it is and it isn't. I think that the problem is that classic international law was based on old wars. And that kind of classic international law doesn't work anymore. And everybody's chosen their own interpretations of international law. So in that sense, international law has been stretched. I mean, one of the ways in which it has been stretched is the understanding of self-defense. So self-defense, when the UN after the war prohibited war, the only exception was either a Chapter 7 decision or self-defense. But self-defense was understood as against an imminent aggression by a foreign state. That understanding has been so stretched. I mean, the most important thing is that it was stretched to apply to non-state actors. That happened after 2011, and that's essentially what Israel has done vis-a-vis Hamas. So, that's the first thing. And then you've had the idea of preventive or anticipatory self-defense, which was invented by Bush to justify the invasion of Iraq. So, first of all, self-defense got stretched, and everyone is claiming whatever happens, it's self-defense. And then international humanitarian law has been hugely stretched. And the idea of, the argument is international humanitarian law doesn't somehow apply to illegal competence because it's not war. So there's so many ways it's got stretched. But on the other hand, we have new bodies of law, international human rights law and international criminal law, that are being developed through the ICC, through the International Court of Justice, and really seem to reflect emerging norms. And, I think both Ukraine and Palestine, the role played by international law has been enormous compared with previous wars. And that is really a breakthrough. I felt the International Court of Justice decision on genocide was a huge breakthrough. But let me go back a few steps, because you were saying, what's the role of international law in ending wars and how do we end wars? And I want to go back a step to where I was talking about how the demonstrators become civil society. And so what we talk about in my program, rather than civil society, we talk about civicness. And civicness is behaving as though you lived in a normal state where the state was responsible for public services. And actually, in all these conflict zones, civicness is ubiquitous. There are doctors who will treat people regardless of their ethnicity. There are teachers who try to keep on teaching. I mean, I just came across, because we're working on it at LSE, an academic who teaches in Gaza, who's now in Egypt, but is still teaching his students online in Gaza. And actually, none of these societies would survive if there wasn't civicness. So my feeling is the problem with the international community is that it thinks it has to talk to the armed actors. But if it saw its role as not necessarily bypassing the armed actors, but they saw their primary partners as civic actors. And that could change things a lot. And in my program, we've done a lot of work on local agreements. I mean, in new wars, there are hundreds of local agreements because that's the way people survive. And some of the local agreements may be horrible agreements. They may be agreements between armed groups to get access to something or other. But sometimes they're local agreements to get food in, to have a local ceasefire. And what we find is that if there's an international presence on the ground, that can really support the civic actors. You get more peace-oriented local agreements rather than war-oriented local agreements. But it seems to me this is a much more hopeful way to go, because if we think of new wars as a long-term social condition, it's trying to move out of that social condition community by community. But civicness also relates to international law, because international law is only as powerful as the people believe it to be powerful. And so strengthening international law is about strengthening norms in society. So I think ending wars is a much more difficult and complicated than having conflict resolution from above. It's to strengthen and grow civicness, which can't be done mean, it can't be done from outside, but where there are civic institutions locally, they can use international help. I mean, you can't artificially, and this is the complaint people make when I talk about civil society. They'll say, we've given millions to civil society, and they have, and they create these artificial NGOs that are not very effective. And that's why I decided to talk about civicness rather than civil society. I mean, I think rather than saying the international community needs it positively to help it, because since the international community makes such a mess, it's rather that it needs not to positively prevent it, which is what happens at the moment, by strengthening armed actors, which happens through conflict resolution processes.
So you've been studying war for decades, and it's hard to know from this conversation how much hope you have. Do you think that humanity can move towards a more post-conflict? Do you think we can reduce conflict in the world?
Well, I'm a deeply optimistic person. So whenever anything horrible happens, my instinct is always to think of the way out. I do think we're in a very grim situation. What we're seeing is the rise of these awful authoritarian leaders, these are the people, oligarchs, who started new wars. So, the election of the Trumps and the Putins and the continuation of all these people is a recipe for long-term forever wars that are really, really difficult to end. So that's one very depressing scenario. And I think the other thing is that these oligarchs are the consequence of the stage in economic development we've reached, in that they're really a product of growing dependence on revenues from fossil fuels. So it's all kind of linked to climate change as well. But on the other hand, I just do think that the ICC and the ICJ and the growth of international law and the general sense you have that people really are very, we live full and active lives, and the idea of going to war for noble purposes is much less prevalent than it ever was before. But I feel there is a real opportunity for experimenting with these alternatives that are both green and human security alternatives, and that if they were seriously experimented, would change things.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines magazine. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Lydia Wilson. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.